Okay, so talk today about the sustainability of social casino and then discuss a bit about how the growth pattern has emerged over the past few years and then, as we're saying, going through a few predictions for the coming years. So looking back at trends over the past year, we can see that the top 10 companies generally haven't changed that much when we look strictly at the rankings. There's been a little bit of movement up and down, a few companies that made it into the top 10 list, a few that got swallowed up by others. But in general, within the social casino market as a whole, the top of the market has stabilized. So we see Caesars, IGT, Zynga, GSN, and Big Fish, then going down to Akamon at 16, focused on Latin America and Southern Europe. And that hasn't changed that much over the past year. As we were saying, a couple things percolated up, a few down, but we can expect probably that this will be the same type of list next year. As far as the sustainability of the industry, going back a few years, there were questions, of course, about whether it was a model that would prove to work over a long term. And from Eilers' research, a report that came out a couple of weeks ago, there was a forecast for 35% year-over-year growth in the industry as a whole. And again, touching on sustainability, there has been resilience in the Facebook platform with the established user bases for the top casinos still monetizing very well for them, and the top casinos playing very well to their existing user bases and maintaining them extremely effectively, even as mobile has emerged and grown on top of that. It hasn't cannibalized Facebook. We've seen a trend of consolidation at the top of the industry, that Caesars, obviously the largest of the industry, has swallowed up House of Fun, which was another top 15 social casino application. We saw that GSN acquired Bash Gaming with Bingo Bash. We've seen that overall in the industry there's been an enormous amount of mobile growth, so that there's been sustained growth of 15% quarter-over-quarter growth in the mobile sector, and it now accounts for 51% of the total industry revenue. So as we touched on in the Playtick presentation earlier this week, it's now representing the majority of the industry. So then, if we're pulling out predictions for the coming years about what's going to stay the same and what's going to change, I think that this may turn out to be embarrassing in a few years when this proves to be horribly wrong, but we'll go out on a limb and assume that it's correct for now. I think we can expect to see new avenues for expansion. Consolidation will probably continue, but in a bit of a different form. That up to this point, it's been taken the form of offline or non-social companies acquiring companies in the social or online space in order to gain a foothold there. Whereas what we're starting to see now is online and social companies making acquisitions within the space in order to fulfill a channel that they hadn't necessarily reached before, and to absorb other competitors in the same space. I think that we'll continue to see mobile as a battleground, but it'll be a bit different. And we'll go into detail on that a bit more later in the presentation. One thing that will remain the same, though, is quality, which has emerged over the past year or so as a distinguishing factor among the top social casino applications. That will remain a distinguishing factor and become even more so. That some of the early applications, of course, had a first mover advantage, and it was as simple as putting a few graphics into spinning reels and putting them up on Facebook. But as the industry has evolved, players are becoming more sophisticated, and they choose the applications that they want to play that are better in terms of quality in the games and the overall experience. Oh. Going into detail, as far as the topic of new distribution channels, I think that we can expect to see that messaging applications will grow as a channel. That right now there's still a bit to be sorted out in terms of the business model for putting applications and deploying them through these. But they're becoming such a dominant part of the social media atmosphere as a whole that all it would really take is one of them to figure out an effective business model and develop a good ecosystem for social casino, and that would become a very effective new distribution channel for social casino applications. Over the past year or 2 years even, we've seen that a lot of the top players have expanded to include multiple environments or applications. That Slotomania was one of the first. As soon as they were acquired by Caesars Entertainment, they opened a Caesars brand casino with a very similar type of content and experience. Now that they've acquired House of Fun, they have a different channel that appeals to a slightly different part of the market. And again, with Bingo Blitz, they launched Bingo Rush 2, and cross-marketed that to the same player base. A lot of that is with the assumption that if players are going to play multiple applications, one single publisher would rather have more of those applications belong to them than to try to build up an application that already has several million users to be double that. And so we've seen that copying off of the play ticket strategy, Williams has launched Goldfish slots in addition to Jackpot Party Casino. And I think that over time we'll see more and more multiple channels coming out of single publishers. And I think long term, we really can't exclude the B2B possibilities, that it's still a market or a part of the market that hasn't really matured and evolved into something that's a viable product yet. But we've seen the beginnings of some white label solutions appealing to offline casinos that want to get into the social casino space. I think that that's the first round of that particular part of the industry. But also, if we look at the land-based part of the industry, if we look at the online real money industry, what's evolved since those industries began is that there have been category killers that have marketed to one particular competence that they are extremely good at. And that's a parallel trend to just about any industry, that if we look back 50 years in PCs, it was IBM and DEC. And now those single vertically integrated suppliers have gone the way of the dinosaur, and the market is much more about single companies that appeal to a particular competence. And given that social casino is the aggregation of multiple competences, I think that long term we really can't exclude that as a possibility for our industry as well. So as a corollary to new channels, there is of course the aspect of new geographies, that currently 70% of the social casino market is in English-speaking markets, predominantly the US, Australia, UK, Western Europe. That leaves a very large part of the world with a lot of money that is not effectively being marketed with social casino product. So, I mean, obviously we have the target markets, which Akamon markets to, Brazil and Latin America. We have Korea, Southeast Asia, China, and obviously Japan in addition to that. There are also non-English markets in traditional geographies. So for example, Spanish-speaking markets in the US, Chinese markets in the US, Australia, etc. These are areas that have a slight subculture within the main geography, but understand the same type of content and are exposed to the same type of media as the overall population. And of course, we have Southern and Eastern Europe, which are a slight distinction from Central Europe or Northern Europe or the UK. Now, each of these has a bit of a different impression about what exactly a casino product means from what a US player would automatically interpret. So, for example, whereas slots are very well known in the US, they're not necessarily well known to Chinese players. Chinese players have probably never seen a casino, so they wouldn't know what a slot machine is, and they wouldn't have impressions off of that. I think that's what the land-based industry has encountered in Macau. Similarly, Brazil has never had, within current memory, casinos. There have been bingo halls, and there are other types of gambling products that are very well known to Brazilians, but the same type of casino product is not as well known. So, given that we'll have a market with new channels opening up in new geographies, that ties into new types of consolidation, that there will be the largest operators still absorbing smaller operators, but it won't take the form of an offline casino acquiring a social game, or an offline or a large online casino acquiring a social division to get a social wing. What we'll see, I think, is that as some players within the US market have grown to be very large on iOS, but not necessarily large on Android. In fact, go into it in a bit more detail later, but Android seems to be a bit neglected within the US market. I think that you'll see some applications that want to make an acquisition in order to gain a foothold in Android to be able to cross-market to other types of content. When we look out in terms of other geographies, there are, of course, social networks other than Facebook, which are very large in those geographies. So China, for example, with RenRen, vContact in Russia. We see other types of social networks in South America and, to some extent, in Southern Europe. Now, with messaging applications, obviously, as a corollary to those growing and opening up as a channel means that if someone were to pop up and become very dominant on one of those, they would become very interesting to one of the largest operators. Again, off of the expansion of new channels with new geographies, Since we see that most of the top social casino applications are marketing to US and English-speaking markets to the exclusion of most other markets, that means that if there are players who are extremely successful in Asia, in South America, in other types of geographies, then those become very interesting to be able to expand and gain new competence in terms of marketing products to those audiences. And of course, I think that some aspects that we've seen have been acquisitions to get better content, that as the industry emerges and then quality becomes a distinguishing factor, then it's very likely that you'll see acquisition of small studios in order to gain solid teams that have products that are different from what other parts of the industry have. Talking a bit more on new mobile battlegrounds, again, Android was an area that said was a bit neglected within the US market. That when we look at social casino revenue overall, there aren't many players in the space who are even between iOS and Android. And you could look at that and say that iOS monetizes quite a bit better. But in practice, there are some social casino applications that are estimated to have about equivalent revenue between the two. So I think that we can expect that Android will become a battleground in its own right, the same way that iOS has been. And then a corollary to that is that tablet will become a bit distinct from mobile. They're slightly different use cases. I mean, you'd use a mobile application in different contexts from where you'd use a tablet, and they take different type of content to be optimized for each of them. So I think that it's a corollary to say that if social casino applications now, if mobile means just taking the same type of content from a phone and putting it on a tablet with a larger size, that's not necessarily going to be ideal. And if someone comes along who is extremely competent at doing tablet, possibly to the exclusion of mobile, that becomes very interesting to see. And of course, the overriding theme is that there's an advantage in the quality of the applications, the quality of the games, and the quality of the experience in each of these. So, touching a bit more on that with quality as a distinguishing factor, it's a bit much to go into at this point with 5 minutes left in the presentation, but just touching on what makes the best applications very good. Overall, they have better games, they have more variety in the application, and they have novelty at various stages. So when we break down the sheer number of games with I would say some of the top quality social casino slot applications, High Five has 100 high quality slots. House of Fun has about 60 slots that are very high quality. Double Down has about 50 plus slots that are very good from the land-based industry and get crossed over, plus video poker and a bingo product in addition to that. And a bit of this is the product of having existing libraries that they can cross-sell to social channels. A bit of this is the product of having new content that comes out with frequency of once every week, 2 weeks, 1 month, enough to give players a novel experience whenever they come back to the application. So overall, that makes a very distinguishing factor versus someone who has 20 lower quality slots or even 3 or 4 lower quality slots. Overall, these applications present a much better experience. I think what we'll see that we haven't seen yet is a more personalized experience. But right now, it's very typical, of course, to find your whales, appeal to them, keep them in the environment, and keep them spending. But I think that one area that's becoming more interesting is the ability to expand that type of personalized experience and that type of relationship between the casino and the player down to the mid-tier of players or even to the non-spenders to be able to convert them into spenders. And so I think that long-term we'll see a bit more personalized marketing, a bit more personalization in the application itself. And altogether, because there is going to be such a distinguishing factor in quality, it's going to make it a bit harder for new entrants to come in on established channels. I think we can see that with the US market that it's very difficult right now for someone to come into Facebook or to iOS and market a new social casino application simply because the quality has become very good and there are very well-established players there. But with new channels, that changes a bit. So we can continue to see new entrants coming in on new channels that are opening up, new geographies that are opening up. So that's all. I'll open it up to questions then.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi.
So you talk about new channels and new geographies. Can you expand on that?
Well, obviously, I think that Akamon, where I work, is a prime example of a company that has carved out a bit of a niche for itself, appealing to Latin American players, and particularly Brazil, where other companies have not been terribly effective marketing their social casino product. I think that tying back to Playtika's presentation from earlier in the week, there was a lot of discussion about the difficulty in existing operators marketing to Asia, and particularly China, and that if someone comes along who can effectively make quality content for them and develop a good player base with a good relationship between the operation and the customers, that becomes very interesting.
Hi. You mentioned that certain games weren't familiar to certain audiences geographically. If we did like an awareness map, what do you think it would look like for poker?
I think poker is probably one of the best known. I think that as a card game, it gets eclipsed in some jurisdictions. So for example, in France, Belote is probably a bit bigger than poker. In China, players might not be as familiar with poker, and it might be better to appeal through other card games. So there's probably awareness of poker in a much wider area than slots, or at least a much more familiar player base to that. But it goes down to the question of, is that the best way to market to those audiences?
Alex, do you think that the games that a lot of these big casino operators have, because now they seem to be buying up all these game developers, they're taking their games that they have on the floor that are in their cabinet machines and deploying them, to the social space? Are those the most popular games now? And do you kind of have to have an inventory of, real money games?
I think that helps quite a bit. There is a large crossover in audiences, particularly in the US, between the land-based casino-going audience and the social casino audience. In practice, I don't think that they, strictly speaking, need to be the same content. I don't believe that it's as much about familiarity with the games as much as the familiarity with that type of content. So for example, take House of Fun as an example of a library of games that's not available on any casino floor, but it's in a style. They follow trends, they look at what's performing out in the land-based environment, and they migrate that into a social environment.
But aren't those the most the games that are generating the highest ARPDAU?
Yeah, I think in general, I think it's possible to do that without it, but I think that it's a much more conservative strategy to look at what performs to typical casino players and then try to market that to a social audience, just because there is a large established understanding of what works for slot players in general. And you are generally appealing to a lot of the same emotions, whether you're winning real money or not.
Anybody else? Okay, good.
Well, beyond the kind of standard copying what's going on the slot floor, do you see anything why am I echoing? Okay. Do you see anything interesting or innovative going on out in the space that kind of moves beyond that?
Well, I think one thing that's come out that has been a bit innovative is, even though slot tournaments are very well known on casino floors, the flavor that they have in social casinos is quite a bit different, and it's very well adapted to the environment that you have, with a lot of players coming in synchronously, being able to play tournaments over and over again. So I think that's a significant innovation that has come out of the social casino industry. In terms of the games themselves, I see a lot of the innovation happening more in the real money side. I can't exclude the possibility that there is, that in a few years, social casino slots will become higher quality than typical land-based slots. But it doesn't seem to be that way now, and it seems like the established players on the real money side are so dominant and invest so much in R&D that it will be a while before that type of game really gets eclipsed by anything on the social side.
So you've had success in Brazil, correct?
Yes.
We've been to a lot of other sessions, and we've seen how Latin America isn't necessarily portrayed as the most promising opportunity. Yet other people have different opinions. Can you tell us more about Latin America and where you see Latin America going beyond Brazil?
Yeah, I think, well, we talk about Brazil because I think that's a bit of a continent in its own right compared to the rest of Spanish-speaking Latin America. And within Brazil, there is a bit of a different type of understanding, particularly with casino products, that Mexico has a bit of a casino environment. You have players there that are very familiar with bingo, with some particular types of bingo. But because there is a very large casino industry there, there's a bit more of an existing slot player base that you could see a parallel trend to what's happened in the US. Brazil is one of those markets that hasn't really had casinos in recent memory. The way that you would appeal to players, acquire them, find the ones that would monetize well, it's going to be a bit different in Brazil. And we've seen quite a bit of success appealing to games that have high acquisition value to get players in, and then cross-market them to games that have higher monetization value.
What are the most popular games in Brazil?
For us, I think in terms of users, our Barraco game is the most popular.
What's that?
It's a card game that's particular to Brazil, a bit like Canasta.
And what about in the other Latin American territories?
In,
Slots or what?
In terms of monetization, the one thing that we see crossing over most is bingo.
Anybody else? Questions? Oh, okay.
So as far as player behavior, what have you seen differences, for example, in Brazil and Mexico, as far as monetization and in-app purchases?
Well, there are purchasers everywhere. I think it's just a matter of conversion rate and then developing that. I think that when you look at the US, there's a very mature industry as far as people being used to paying in Facebook, paying on mobile devices. And that exists in Brazil. It's just a matter of needing to be cultivated a bit more.
You feel the same way about Mexico as well?
Sorry, do you want to put the mic on it?
You feel the same way about Mexico as well?
I think Mexico is very likely similar. I think they have a bit more of a monetizing environment there, at least from what we've seen. I think one of the challenges that I have answering the question is that we know our environment, we know what works for us. We think that we're doing better than most players in the industry, and the market rankings seem to have proven that out. However, we're still figuring out new things about it.
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you, Alex.
Thanks.